Okay. Hi, 6 o'clock, so we'll start the delivery of the private housing stock task and finish group meeting. Is there any apologies?
I think we've had apologies from Councillor Spate, but that is the answer we've received.
Okay, thank you. Has everybody, agenda item 4, has everybody read the minutes and can I have them agreed? Okay, I've had no items of urgent business and declarations of interest, everyone. No, then we're fine. Then let's go into the lessons learnt from the Perfleet Regeneration TRL. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. I haven't got a presentation or a paper today in the conventional sense of a PowerPoint because I think we will probably gain more benefit from a discussion around some of the points that I raise. There will be areas where perhaps we might venture into confidential territory, but I will hold back from that and we can take a view later on in the meeting if you feel that the conversation would benefit from being in a private session. But I'm happy to talk through where we're at. As you'll be well aware from our discussions around PCRL, there are a number of confidential matters at the moment that will come into the public domain in due course that I could share in a private session, but not publicly at the moment. But I will work on the basis that we have a public audience. And I'm keen that we also focus on what success might look like rather than simply picking over the bones of past failures. The BVI report talks in some detail about general issues with the council, and I think you could apply many of those points to both TRL and to Perfleet Regeneration. But as I say, I'll pick on a few specifics. I'm obviously well aware that with Evelina's input and Julian's input in the past, there may be some areas that you've covered that I touch on. So if we're going over old ground, just tell me to move on. But I think in both cases, I want to highlight the fact that there is mixed success out there. It's not just a Thurrock issue. There are specific issues to Thurrock, but the failure of local authority housing companies to deliver at the scale that they were expected to do is not just a Thurrock issue. There are many others that have failed to deliver what they were set out to do. And in the case of Croydon, for example, various governance issues around their housing company were part of their move into intervention. But I think what we need to learn is why we want to set up a company. Is it to develop housing? And if so, what type of housing? Why wouldn't you leave it to the market? Is there a market failure, or is it actually a viability issue? And very often I think with local authorities, they feel that it's a market failure, but actually it's just that that type of housing is not viable. Now that is one definition of market failure, but it can be solved by other means than simply setting up your own company. So you need to think about where are you adding value? Equally, in terms of developing housing, you need to think about why does it need a company? Some will tell you that it keeps it off the balance sheet. In a public sector organisation, that's not the case. It's always on your balance sheet. Irrespective, it might be on your HRA balance sheet, it might be on your general fund balance sheet, but it still contributes to the national debt and it still has the same governance arrangements. So very often people set up companies to develop housing thinking that they are managing risk by keeping it separate, but that's not always the case. Local authorities I've worked for before and Evelina's worked for and Julian will have worked with have successfully delivered housing in various tenures without need for a company. Are you setting it up to own housing? Now that might be different. Again, what type of housing and why? very much the same questions. And a usual response is that you need a company to have assured short hold tenancies if you are a stockholding council, because the law doesn't. Government has talked numerous times about changing that because they see it as a loophole, but that's often reason. So I don't think, from what I've seen of reviewing TRL or even its previous incarnations, that we've never really been clear about why this company exists and what its priorities are. I think we also need to look at what skills we have and what already and what do we need. I think with no disrespect to any of the individuals involved, TRL has been resourced on a sort of make do and mend basis. I think we've had some good skills within the HRA team and assumed that they can match this. But what they haven't had is a strong client and strong governance from the board. And again, I don't think that's a criticism of individuals on the board, but I do think that the balance of the board, if we were doing it again, I would consider differently. We've gone from having an all-officer board to an all non-exec board, and my experience is that the more successful organisations have a blend and a greater alignment with the corporate identity. I do think that, as with many governance issues, whether it is as an accountable body or in the case of TRL as a shareholder, we haven't necessarily played that role as strongly as we should. And again, I think that's part of the downfall. But I think the biggest reason that TRL hasn't delivered is that it hasn't really had a clear business plan for some time, and that hasn't been aligned with corporate objectives. There are good examples out there. I'll mention 60 Bricks at Waltham Forest. I'm sure others have got other examples. And I think if you look at them, they are much clearer about what they want to do. Their focus is on a mix of social rent, shared ownership, and for sale. They're not looking at market rent. TRL's main focus to date has been market rent. They have a board which has more sector experience, but with officer representation to make sure the council's priorities are there. And they have an experienced chief executive officer, relatively recently appointed, I admit, and a development director with experience from the private sector. And I know we have that in the way we set up TRL, but not directly within the company. So I think there are some lessons to be learned. Whether they are relevant to Thurrock at the moment is another point, because we're not going to have the money to invest. We're selling off TRL's assets, and I don't see us having the money to invest outside of the HRA, and it's even going to be a struggle inside the HRA for some time. So I think we can learn some lessons from TRL, but by the time we want to put those into practice, we might be in a different place. So my view is that we decide what we're going to do with TRL. We've agreed what we're doing with the assets at the moment. We've yet to agree what we do with the company. There are various recommendations around that. But then I think we move on. In terms of Purfleet on Thames, again, I'd make the point that probably with the exception of King's Cross, all regeneration schemes struggle with viability, and many fail at the first attempt. Canary Wharf went bust in 1992 and only survived and thrived after that because debt was written off. Barking Riverside, I remember it being called Barking Reach. I got involved. I built the Asda as part of Phase 1 in 1987. That went bust in 1992. Took the Development Corporation a huge amount of money from the mayor to kick that off again, 2007 and onwards. Thamesmead, across the river, Ebbsfleet, Meridian Water, all failed on their first attempt and took a different approach. So there are lessons to be learned from Purfleet, but it's not just a Thurrock issue, and I think that's really important. I think looking ahead and looking at what we've done in the past and why we wouldn't do it again, procurement competitions are frequently won by the best bidder, but infrequently by the best partner. And I think we need to think about that. There are plenty of really good regeneration delivery organisations who don't go near major procurements simply because they're hugely expensive and the outcomes are not always what they want. So we need to think about how we procure going forwards. I think the key issue with Perfectly on Thames is you need to be clear about where the money is coming from day one. None of the partners has ever had anything like the money to deliver anything more than 30, 50 homes at any point. And we need to consider why people are investing and what is their role. And I'll leave that there because I think we potentially move into confidential territory. I think the council has to build a strategic relationship with Homes England, not just around the HRA, but generally. We haven't really had that. And this will chime with you, Councillor Watson, and others, I'm sure, but we have to be honest with the community. We don't overpromise and then keep overpromising. Development on this scale takes a long time. It will never happen in the order you set out it to do, and a lot will change. And if you are not honest with the community about that throughout, then you'll lose them. And we'd lost them. I think we're starting to get them back, but we had lost them on Perfectly on Thames. And again, I go back, it's in the BVI, governance of this project has not been strong enough. We haven't kept a handle on what PCRL have been up to. They have been ahead of us on comms, and they have been ahead of us on a number of areas. And a scrutiny of it hasn't been good enough either. And I think that goes back to conversations we've had at PTRO&S, that when reports have come before the committee, there have been short edited highlights of limited success and a lack of honesty about the real challenges. So my view is that Perfectly regeneration is a project the council should be promoting and bringing on board a partner, but it isn't the answer to housing delivery in Thurrock in the short term, to replicate that model elsewhere. Over time, if we can show we can do it better, we can build a strategic relationship with Homes England, build a strategic relationship with other nationally significant funding partners who want to reinvest, then potentially. But for me, I think we need to move on from TRL, reinvent Perfectly on Thames, and we do have a meeting coming up with a potential major investor, including government funding, shortly, and that will come through the committee system in due course. But I think we have to look elsewhere for how we deliver major housing in the borough.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So before I have any sort of questions, is anybody got any questions? Councillor Haldon.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Mark, for your presentation. I think one of the things that was so irritating about PCRL was they won award after award from various planning bodies, and they won various recognitions from DLARC or DCLG beforehand. And at no stage, when members and when certain officers were highlighting concerns, did those concerns get taken very seriously. And it always felt at the time, one of the reasons they weren't being taken seriously is because there were perhaps a cadre of people who were romanced by the awards that they were winning, by the presence of very gregarious individuals involved in the project, Sir Tim Lawrence, etc. So Can you give what is your view on why some of the very clear warning signs weren't going off, and how exactly they got in a position where they were winning, very substantial sums of money from Homes England, while they were winning awards when their logistical progress was incredibly weak, and when a number of us were calling out those concerns.
It goes back to governance and scrutiny. I appreciate that there were, as members you'll say, from the scrutiny point of view, you were flagging these up. I think there's a weakness in the development agreement. The funding from Homes England was awarded, the applicant was the council with support from PCRL. So that was a vote of confidence in the council as much as PCRL. There was at the time an over-reliance on long lists of potential funders without much substance behind them. And I think, honestly, until such time as the funding agreement with Homes England and then the parallel agreements that sat behind that, until that time, there was never any mechanism for raising those concerns. And under the development agreement with Homes England, we'd got up to the 7th reservation of rights letter before basically they ran out of patience. But prior to that, I don't think the council had ever robustly taken PCRL to task and said, why isn't it delivering? What are you going to do about it? There was always, as you say, Ken or Sir Tim saying, there's jam tomorrow, just wait. And we waited too long.
Madge? So does that speak to internal capacity of the council with regards to being able to identify systemic weaknesses in the PCRL model? So were we essentially not adequately resourced internally to be able to identify some of these warning signs and then act on them in a sufficiently robust way?
Apologies. I think if you look at the fact that many of the same individuals were involved in other regeneration projects which similarly didn't make progress, I think it is a combination of lack of people, but primarily skills, attitude and aptitude. I don't think we had people who were prepared to challenge this. There's a long history of people coming in on contracts, temporary appointments, and that's not always a bad thing, but there was no continuity here. There was no real ownership of this. And I would say that, without mentioning any names in an open forum, there was an industry around people who were making enough money for this not to happen, for them to be happy. And that's not just in terms of people we appointed, but I would go as far to say as others involved in the project. But again, in an open forum, I'll leave it there at the risk of slander.
So if we did have these,
thereof.
so if we did have these problems where, as you say, some people were perfectly content that progress wasn't being made because money was still being made by some individuals, and we had a problem where we didn't have that internal skill set, and we had too many temporary people, not enough people permanently assigned to the project. How do we now get ourselves into a position where we can adequately assess what we do need for projects of the like? Because one of the things that I recall very vividly at the time, when I became the Cabinet Member for Education in 2016, and we had to take the delivery of the Harris School that's now in Purfleet away from them, and myself and my officers had to provide financial reassurance to the Department for Education that the project could be delivered outside of the PCRL red line. One of the criticisms that was levelled at Cabinet from certain quarters, no longer with the authority, was what is the how do you substantiate your complaints? Because this is a body that keeps winning awards. This is a body that keeps on attracting major partners. This is a body that keeps on attracting funding. So we were always made to feel like we were uneducated laymen who just couldn't appreciate that brilliant things were happening around us. Now, you've articulated that clearly we had an internal problem where people in the council couldn't manage some of these projects. So how do we assess now what skills we need to partner up with these types of things in the future, and how do we draw that distinguishing line between we were assured that we had the skills then, we clearly didn't with the benefit of hindsight, so how can we now be sure that we are attracting those skills that we do need for substantial regeneration projects?
So I keep forgetting this. I think there's two things. Again, we've got to, before you answer that, you've also got to answer what is our role going to be going forwards. Is it going to be as a facilitator? Is it going to be as an investor? And therefore, what are we physically going to be doing? But irrespective of that, the key is not what we're going to be doing. It's still what are we as a client? What is our governance? Who is this reporting to? Who is sense checking anything that any officer says, frankly? And I think we're in that territory because of the history of some of our projects. It's not for a director to come and say, I've got the best team for this. It's for the director to bring you evidence of why they are the best team, and perhaps some peer confidence as well, to show that we've got that. We've got to build that trust, because yes, it's very easy for me to say this is how we should do it, and this is who we should employ. But if you trust me, then I'll be disappointed, and I mean that in the right way, because I think we should be challenging that and we should be looking at it. I am in the process of talking to some individuals who've advised many major regeneration schemes in the past, including people who've been involved from the public sector side, and I would hope that when we come forward with a proposal that I'll be able to bring those endorsements of our approach from people who are not simply saying yes because they're getting the job.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just really to support what Mark's saying to you. I think he's right that it starts with role. The governance is hugely important. The one thing I set a bit more store by the procurement than Mark does, because that is part of your governance in my view, and a procurement done well, although he's right that it's expensive, but a procurement done well can help you on the way, and it can help clarify those roles. But just to support what he says about the skills are absolutely critical. You need the right skills for what you're doing. You will need careful recruitment, and it is not just about the internal people who you appoint as your client. It is also about your advisors who you get from the private sector, and you need absolute confidence in them, and you need to examine their track record, and you need to work fairly carefully with them. I think the other thing just worth saying, and it's cold comfort, I realise, but actually you need to understand that those skills are in short supply. The people who actually understand local authorities but also have a degree of commercial acumen are relatively few in number. So it is a challenging task. But I think the basis of what Mark said, I'd agree with entirely. It's about making sure you've got the right people doing the right things, and you are governing and you are challenging.
Any other questions? Okay, I've got a couple of questions if that's okay. So can we first of all look at TRL? And one of the things I'm really interested in is why did it fail so bitterly when at the same time TRL was actually set up, so did other organisations in Newham, Barking and Dagenham, Waltham Forest also had their own companies, and that actually were building out under the HRA and the General Fund on all different tenures. So it wasn't just on full private sales. So what happened within the TRL structure here that was so different than anywhere else?
I think I need to make it clear that TRL has successfully developed St Chad's, and some issues with housing management, not by us, I have to add, aside, if the council was in a different financial position, you could have continued to own that and slim down the organisation of TRL and made some money out of it. The next development it was looking to do, and the name's completely gone out of my head.
Well, there was the
Belmont.
Belmont Road.
Yeah.
And the other one at Culver Centre.
Yeah, the Belmont Road's the one I was talking about. I mean, TRL will strongly argue that the reasons that didn't proceed were down to the council and not development reasons. And the council, TRL could have delivered a perfectly acceptable in planning terms development on that site, but the council chose to proceed down a different route for political reasons and community reasons. So I don't think I think we need to make it clear that TRL hasn't delivered anything that's failed. What it hasn't had is a clear business plan to go on from that. I can't see. I mean, they don't appear to have had an up-to-date business plan since 2019. And I can't see where there is the clarity between whether it is a developer or an investor or both, and why both. As I say, other housing companies have focused on supporting the HRA to deliver social housing, for social rent in the case of Waltham Forest, and shared ownership, and using a limited amount of private sector sales to support that. Those that have tried to be more commercial are the ones that sometimes struggle. I think Barking and Dagenham's company is slightly different. It's much more than a housing company. It's basically an outsourced regeneration team. I think it goes back to a lack of clarity about why, and then not properly resourcing it to deliver a bit. But you can't resource a business plan if you don't have clarity around your business plan. And whilst and this is not a criticism of individuals, but there hasn't been that leadership from the chair or staff within TRL at the level needed. And again, it's not criticism of the individuals. The chair is an ex-council officer who happened to have housing under his portfolio, but is not a housing specialist. And the officer is an experienced council officer, but not a housing specialist. And we've relied on buying that in, either from elsewhere in the council. But it's very difficult to buy in if you don't know why or what you're buying. So I do think it's just it was never set up right with a clear business plan and then the resources to deliver that. It would still be in difficulty today because of the market. And most of the companies that are out there are pausing at the moment and just waiting carefully to decide when to go back on site. So we'd be having conversations about TRL even if we were in more favourable financial climate ourselves, because the market would be causing us to think about where it goes from here.
So the other question I wanted to ask is, can you just give us a bit of an update where the PCRL is now, without going confidential, in terms of the scheme itself, and what is the proposed plans for it, bearing in mind that we all know it's my ward and that the residents very, very much want it. They've had their heart and soul into that design, and we want to try and maintain that. So, but I also at the same time would like to do that, but also ensure that we never go back to a place where we've been with PCRL.
Yes, so I'm conscious that you will be more aware of the detail than most of the others, but we have terminated, first of all, the funding agreements with Homes England. We've done those mutually with Homes England in a way that means they have agreed not to claw back any of the investment made to date. So anything that we've spent on the planning process land remediation or land acquisition using Homes England funding. They are not asking for back. There's a slight proviso to that, that if we decided that we weren't going to proceed with the project and to simply sell the land, any land that has been bought with Homes England money, they have the ability to ask for that money back. But that's entirely reasonable if we decide to sell it and they paid for it. They should ask for it back. But the important thing is they're not asking for it back now, and that's in part, well, in a huge part, because they still believe that Purfleet is Purfleet on Thames. John and colleagues will tell me off if I keep forgetting to put the on Thames bit on. I'm sure others will as well. They still believe that it has real potential and they want to work with us to find another way to deliver it. So those have been brought to an end. PCRL were offered the opportunity to co-sign that agreement, but chose not to at that stage. That's not a problem because the core agreement was direct with us and Homes England. If we hadn't done that, Homes England would have litigated to terminate the agreement and ask for the money back. So that, as described in the October Cabinet report, was the right thing to do for the project and for the council going forwards. We rapidly followed that with termination of the development agreement with PCRL. That was achieved with the support of the PCRL board, so they voted to support that as directors and accept that that agreement would come to an end. There's a slight nuance in that one of the shareholders, who's also a director, didn't vote as a shareholder, but that doesn't matter because the directors voted to support it, and the shareholder, if they have any action, will be against PCRL, not against the council. But that development agreement has come to an end. That development agreement had step-in rights that enabled Swan to step in and say, well, if PCRL can't do it, can we? Swan did not want to exercise it in respect of the whole project. Not a great surprise in their current circumstance. But they have stepped in and will complete phase 1A, 1A1, and with their Sanctuary hat on, because Swan are now owned by Sanctuary, Sanctuary have the ability to complete phase 1A2. I've got a long list of community asks, which I know you've been copied in on, Chair, and we will be setting up meetings to make sure that the relationship between the council and Swan is better than the relationship between the council and Swan via PCRL. And time will tell, but it made no sense to stop them building houses that are half finished. Even if some of the community might prefer them to be demolished and replaced by something that looks different. But that made no sense. And they had the right to do that, and we would have had to come up with significant grounds to say that they couldn't because they were step-in rights. And had Swan not been successful in securing a merger into Sanctuary, and Swan being in the financial situation they were in previously, we might have resisted that, but with Sanctuary, who are one of the larger housing associations behind them, we couldn't. In terms of going forward, we are having discussions. The Cabinet report references the English Cities Fund. The English Cities Fund is a partnership between Homes England, the government, through their housing delivery agency, Legal and General, and Muse, which is the development arm of Morgan Sindall, who are a major construction organisation. Those conversations continue. Homes England are interested in principle around a discussion around what's called bill funding. So we've moved on from HIF to BIL, and that's their latest funding stream based on brownfield land. The advantage for Purfleet, if we are able to make that work, is that it has a longer timeline for delivery than HIF had. The problem with HIF was even if we'd been able to bring an investor in, in the last 6 months, we wouldn't have had time to complete HIF. And again, it's worth making the point that problems with HIF funding are not a Thurrock problem. There are plenty of other HIF-funded projects that are not able to meet the timescales, in part for structural reasons and in part because of the way the market has moved in the last year or so. But I think there's a real prospect there. I think it goes back to the point Councillor Holden meant. We have got to make sure we have the right partner. We've got to build a better relationship with them, and in the nicest possible way, a relationship built on trust that doesn't trust them, if you see what I mean. It goes back to my point about you not trusting. We've got to challenge. No matter how much we trust them, we've got to keep challenging them and making sure that we don't just get fobbed off with promises of jam tomorrow.
Councillor Holden.
Thanks, Chair. Just following on from Councillor Watson's question, the future arrangements post PCRL, as you just outlined, are incredibly complicated. One of the things that is still a sticking point for me is when we challenged some of these issues when L&Q were forced to depart at one stage. I do recall us being told quite aggressively that we were undermining officers fatally by questioning whether or not some of their advice was accurate or right. So, without being impertinent, how can we be sure that your assessment of the situation is right? Because, bless us, we're very dim politicians, and my ability to make sure that you are right may be slightly lacking. So, given the size of Thurrock as a very small unitary with a regeneration capacity the size of a county, is there something to be said about us requiring some type of external peer review function when it comes to some of these major projects? And I'm not just talking about PCRL now or TRL. I'm talking about the Blackshots Towers and the progression of certain elements of the local plan, like the brand new potential like garden village in the east of the borough. Do we not need to look at what some sort of independent peer review function looks like? Because everything you've outlined so far doesn't solve for me the original premise, which was there were too many people in this building who didn't see the PCRL disaster coming, and I'm still not convinced I understand how we see the wood for the trees and build that internal capacity.
I think there's a couple of points there. I think in terms of not seeing the PCRL issues coming, I suspect that plenty of people did, but just didn't want to tell you. If any officer thinks members are dim, then they've missed the point. I know you were making it as a point, no. I mean, all projects should have regular gateway reviews, and we should consider who does those gateway reviews, and it shouldn't be the person who's doing the job day to day. And I think if we go back to the A13 project, one of the successes of that project was when we had a proper review and got it back on track as a result. It still went a bit further over for different reasons, but that project would have been way, way worse had we not done a proper external gateway review at that time. So I think, yes, we should look at how we build that into all of our projects and think about who does those. I think with Purfleet, if we are able, and I'll go back to Julian's point, I'm not against procurement, I'm just against overcomplicated procurement that's run by procurement people rather than by people who are actually going to have to deliver the project at the end of it. You need advice from procurement people about what you can and can't do, but ultimately the project needs to come up with a positive outcome for the project, not for procurement. And that sounds critical of procurement people, but again, it's you've got to client that properly. But I think if we are able to do something with English Cities Fund, I think one of the advantages is that by having something like Homes England as an investor, not just a funder, we'll get that extra level of governance, because for a small local authority like Thurrock, this is a big scheme, and I do think the picking of our partners and making sure that the balance between what is commercial and what is the community purpose of doing this in the first place is right. I don't know, Julian, if you wanted to add anything to that?
If I may, Chair, yes, thank you. I mean, again, largely agree with Mark. I think I would just add two things. The first is to give you some support, which is say that on any scheme, you are perfectly entitled at any time to ask any question, and it is not undermining the officers. It is about getting the right answers and doing your job as governance. So I would have been, in the days when I had a proper job, I would have been very upset if any of my officers had said that to you. And I think the second encouragement I'd give you, of course, is, and I think it probably chimes with something Mark said, that, of course, the challenge shouldn't just be to the officers, but it should be to the partner as well. I think the other thing I'd say is I think it's entirely legitimate for you to call for a review of any project. I think the only encouragement or advice I would give you is make sure that you have the right level of commercial skills and advice on looking at these, because from what I understand, part of the issue is that lack of commerciality. This is not just going to the LJ and say, can we have a collection of local government officers like both Mark and I have been on in the past. This is about real solid commercial advice. So if you're going to review something, get the right people there to do it. I think those are the two things I'd add.
Can I speak? I was one of the councillors who went on, well, the only one who turned up on the tour round when they were going to regenerate it in the first place. And to me, we're sitting on prime land where you could make lots of money if we could attract the right person in, as James said, to develop it, And to regenerate the waterfront, we're sitting on, prime land to make money, And I look forward to the day that happens,
I think if you just wanted to build houses, there are sites down there that you could build them tomorrow, and somebody would make a lot of money. But if you want to build a community and you want to repair some of what's already down there, there are some major infrastructure requirements that are needed. And that's the challenge, because the real value will come by getting those at the beginning. And that's our challenge, because what will make this really fly is the arrival experience, the location, in terms of its distance from London, is, it's only a few minutes more than many developments elsewhere along the north and south bank of the Thames. That are doing fine, but the arrival experience at that station is not great, and the facilities around it, there's no centre to Purfleet. It's probably the one thing that they got right was calling it Purfleet Centre regeneration. They just didn't deliver that. So I think you could build on most of those sites, and somebody will make some money, but then you'll look back at it and you'll go, we wasted an opportunity here. So the challenge is to get that infrastructure, and it's not just the crossing of the railway line at the new station. Doctor's surgeries, it is much more embedded than that, and that's why the community support it. We're going to have huge battles over other settlements across Thurrock that are being mooted through the local plan process around infrastructure. Purfleet shows that if you engage the community well, you can get them behind. Fairly sized, getting on for 3,000 homes is a big scheme for a relatively small place at the moment, and to get a community behind that is a real success. Trick is now to keep them behind it, through this change. And I went along to the forum meeting last week. I've been to see them before. I told them I would be honest. I think I've kept up my track record of being straight with them. We're going to have to keep doing that all the way through this. Because the only person really who was coming and telling them stuff was Ken before. Officers didn't get involved. There was no challenge to the community either to say what you're being told needs to be challenged. Don't believe it. It needs to be challenged. Again, I'm not having a go at Ken. His job was to keep that project alive for as long as possible till he gets some funding. But our job was to say enough's enough, and we got to a point where we said enough's enough.
So personally for me, going forward, I want the site to obviously come through exactly as it was because of that consultation. But we haven't just got, Councillor Walden was right, we haven't just got the perfect regeneration. We're going to have more regeneration happening throughout the borough, and we've actually got planning permission on some of these developers that are already sitting in there, like Linford 240, there's more going into Stamford, and I'm not convinced we're actually holding them to account on what that build should be and what that development should be, and that they change things quite quickly. And I think that going forward, two things: the residents need to be more consulted a lot more on what is happening in their area, not just like a little like bit of paper on a lamppost. I actually think that the ward councillors, it doesn't matter if you're a backbencher or your cabinet or your leader, they need to be well briefed about what is happening in their ward. That doesn't happen either, because it's the ward councillors that are going to be the one that's going to be fighting off the residents, because they will get it from the residents before the officers will. And I think that it has to be that flow of communication all the time. And more importantly, is what we see is to be delivered needs to be delivered. And if we see something coming through, like the Linford one, that started to build and stopped, we didn't know, none of us knew about that until it came to a committee. And nor did the residents know. So it's really important we have to keep that communication up.
Yeah, I think it's a valid point, obviously, because you're talking about a different contractual relationship to Perfectly, because obviously we have a contractual relationship, or we hope to have, we hope to have a new one, with somebody to deliver things on our behalf. But when you've got planning applications and Section 106 agreements, there's still a contractual arrangement. It's just a different type of arrangement. And we acknowledge, and the PAS review of the Planning Service acknowledges that we need to have a different approach to enforcement. And enforcement is during a development as well as afterwards. Our approach needs to be more in line with what the community wants than what planning purists want, because some things we think we need to enforce against, like the heights of fences and things like this, the community isn't really worried about, and yet we're missing stuff that they are worried about. So that, as part of the PAS review, we do need to think about how we manage the delivery of projects through, once they've got planning consent, we make sure that it's being delivered, we make sure there's a constant dialogue with them, and that if there are minor variations, and there always will be, that the community are aware of them, even if they're delegated. If the community suddenly say that looks different to what I thought it was going to be, then we haven't really done the job, have we? Because we should be communicating where there are those changes. So I think that's one for the planning team, because being, as I said, I think we should continue with Perfleet, but we're not going to be a financial or commercially contracted partner in much else for a while beyond the HRA. So we have to think about how we support those developments and how we support the communities through those developments through the planning process.
Councillor Horden.
Thanks, Chair. Just a very, very brief one, Mark, in regards to the planning service review. The only area where I would disagree with you slightly, I get that we'd neither have the time capacity nor should we have the inclination to go after every fence, but I think the enforcement over the small things is actually really important. I think if you don't get the small things right, you don't get the big things right. And by and large, for most of the complaints we get, I won't speak for either of my colleagues, I don't get complaints about some of the really big things that happen in my community. I get complaints about a myriad of small, niggly things that go wrong, and combined, they add up to become a substantial problem. And one of the things that gripes me is that we worked incredibly hard over certain documents that we use to underpin the service, like the design guide to regulate development. And when when policies in the design guide don't get adequately adhered to, not only does it make members look foolish, it does encourage other developers to actively try and do the same thing in the future. And I would just say, as if anything, just to kind of protect officers from criticism, I would always caution against the use of delegated authority wherever humanly possible. Elected members exist to make decisions. That's why we get elected. If we're going to sign something off that perhaps the community aren't happy with, the community should be able to see a very clear audit trail and should be able to criticise councillors for how we voted. So if I've voted to waive an obligation, that's entirely my problem, and people should be able to criticise me for it. I think that where we have tended to, at times, overuse delegation in the past, I think it creates that aura of mystery, that aura of mistrust, and I think it does encourage developers to consider our design guide to be more of a set of aspirations rather than something that we would like to see more akin to rules. That's just a personal point.
Thank you. So for me going forward, I think the PCRL should have a lessons learnt, so it doesn't replicate itself anywhere else in the borough if possible. And whatever that lessons learned document is that I'm hoping you'll put together, it'd be good if you could share it to the panel here as well as the housing scrutiny. But is there any other questions? Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for everything. Okay, so the final thing on the agenda is the future of this task and finish group. So, going forward, unfortunately, the task and finish group hasn't had very many meetings, and that's probably as well due to the fact that it's been caught up amongst all the other scrutinies and extraordinary meetings and extraordinary scrutinies that we've had to go through as well. So it hasn't really happened. And would it go into the next municipal year? For me, right at this moment in time, I think we should park it. And the reason I think on that is because the local plan is out to consultation. That will have an impact on our documents, and that will have an impact on the way we will deliver, and we would expect to have delivered of schemes within our borough. But I'm quite happy, open for a discussion. Nick.
I think there's a natural. I'm not quite sure I would just support the idea of parking it. I think that there are natural trigger points that we would be interested in. So the current consultation regarding the local plan, that is going to spit out feedback regarding the principle that the community see. Do they like this development? Do they not like this development? I think what is more pertinent for this committee is that when we are looking at some of the more aspirational projects, yeah, again, I referenced the 5,000 in Stamford and Corrin, just because it's on the top of my head, that it's for this group not to look at the community feedback regards to whether or not they want it, because that is for the full council. It's for this group to look at it and to kick the tires and say, do we actually think that is a realistic project to actually fall into the local plan? So I think perhaps, when is this round of feedback closing, Mark?
5 o'clock on Monday the 19th of February.
Yeah.
This consultation.
So I would suggest perhaps a month after that, so officers have had the opportunity to digest feedback.
We could go on that one.
Apologies. I mean, bearing in mind the focus of this is on housing delivery, I wonder whether that is too soon. Some of you will be aware of a grouping of developers called the Thurrock Residential Developers Partnership. I know that had some comment in the media because its current chair is an ex-council employee. But I've been trying to get that group to channel their response to the local plan through our developer forum approach, and for them to start to focus on how we can support housing delivery. So I think it might be worth a conversation with them as to what their response is and how they think, as a group of developers, we can support them with delivery going forwards. But I suspect a month after the local plan will be too soon for that, because we're doing a further piece of work now, which I've just agreed with Tracy and the chief exec, around how we resource the next phase of the local plan, and how we then think about, as I say, our vision for the place linked to that, and what our role is in making it happen, because plans and promises deliver nothing.
Yeah, so just to add really on the back of, you know, what, yeah, in terms of scrutiny. So I think, as some of you may know, that there's big changes that are being proposed for 24-25 in terms of how overview and scrutiny is going to run. So the proposals are to reduce it from 6 to 3 committees. Task and finish groups will have a much more kind of focused remit on, you know, with tangible outcomes that will have a maximum, you know, time limit. So it's just something to consider, that obviously we're going into PERDA in the next month. Yeah, next month. So it's really, you know, whether you want to continue up until that point, up until, you know, the start of PERDA, and then maybe reconsider in, you know, when the new overview and scrutiny, you know, if it starts in May 2024, or whether you're quite happy to disband and then the work that's going on at the moment then be subsumed into the new overview and scrutiny committee, you know, in next municipal year. Because I think the last thing you really, you know, from a, you know, personally, the last thing you want is to have these meetings without any tangible outcome. And I think that's really important moving forward. But it's up to, you know, members and officers really as to how you want to proceed, whether you want to, you know, continue or whether you want to disband. And then obviously if you continue, how that will fit into the new scheme in 24-25.
So going forward for me, I think that we need to digest whatever Councillor Haldon wanted. That's not going to be ready by this time of PERDA, to be honest with you, by the way you go and you're going to have a look at it and then bring it back. So I'm happy to, if that's okay with the rest of the panel, is disband, and then going into the new ONS structure, how that will fit within the ONS structure then, because that will be under the people, place and yeah. So just see how it goes then, and
Just
pick it up under the place ONS.
Yeah, just to add, so what can happen is that there can be other ways of looking at issues in 24-25 if it's agreed, you know, so we can have either task and finish groups, or we can have kind of spotlight events or more informal meetings, so that, you know, nothing gets left behind, because that's one of the concerns that I know members had raised, was issues getting left behind, and that's something we want to avoid. So there are ways that it'll be picked up, and it's something that we can raise. We're going to DMTs, so we can raise this with officers as well. You know, and also just to add that if you do want to disband, it has to go to Housing ONS for their agreement. But that's the recommendation that we can make if that's what, you know, members agree to.
I think there is an expectation that any of those subgroups, task force, focus areas are parented by an ONS, and obviously at the moment the proposal is that this will sit under the place ONS, which equally the local plan will sit under. The chair of PTR ONS has been pushing me to bring a report on the consultation to the next PTR ONS, but bearing in mind the consultation finishes on the 19th and the next PTR ONS is on the 21st, I'm basically saying there's going to be nothing to scrutinise at that meeting, but a report on the local plan consultation will go to one of the first meetings of the new place ONS. As far as I'm concerned, obviously it'll be for the chair to agree in due course, but my view is it will go there, and then my suggestion is, following that, this group, if it is agreed that it carries on underneath that, can look at the housing delivery implications of the local plan as it stands. Because again, all we will have is the consultation response. It will be next autumn before we have that translated into a different version of the options plan. We'll get a feel for whether there will be challenges around most of those larger suggested settlements or settlement extensions, and we'll need to go through that. But in parallel with that, absolutely we should be looking at, as and when these developments come forward, how do we manage their delivery? How do we support their delivery and make sure that, A, if we put them in a plan, they do actually happen, but in a way that supports the design guys and everything else. And just, I wasn't suggesting we don't follow that. It's just that, we get a number of issues where a window is a slightly different shape, and that's all that's changed. And you wouldn't expect that to go back to committee, but the resident thinks, well, if that's changed, what else has changed? And that starts a conversation about, what else are they trying to save money on or avoid doing, because there's a natural distrust of developers, and sometimes they bring it on themselves, and I speak as a former developer.
So I'm quite happy to take that stance, Councillor Hord and Councillor Shinnock. You okay with that?
I'm outvoted.
Pardon?
I'm outvoted.
Okay. I think going forward, I don't really want to lose the work. So under the new ONS structure, if we could just pick that back up, because under whether it's a task and finish group or whatever else you at that time that is called, that would be really good. But also there isn't a local development plan task group anymore, and there is going to be work that's falling out of that. So maybe that goes into this sort of role as well, make it into one. Hold on, Mark.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to obviously reiterate some of the bits that Lucy actually mentioned, that with the new ONS structure as well, we are going to be limited to 2 task and finish groups per ONS committee. So obviously we will be considering everything that kind of gets chucked into the mix, but obviously take all your points about whether we can actually sort of join 2 groups together that were previously existed. But yeah, we're just working obviously through the actual intricacies of what particular task and finish groups there could potentially be within the new structure.
Okay. I thought the task and finish groups will fall out of the ONS anyway, whatever the chair and those members decide at that given time, and not that they're not freestanding already.
To be fair, it's all been in the sort of the process of being worked out, but the recommendation is that there's a maximum of 2 task and finish groups per ONS.
I was just going to comment on the local plan group. There will be a new, and it was set out in the recommendations on the 6th of December on the council report, there will be a new local plan group, but it'll be an all-party group. And it won't be a public group. There will be plenty of opportunities for public scrutiny of the local plan, but the view is that we need cross-party, and including the non-political alliance of the independent councillors, and we agreed that at the council meeting. But a lot of those conversations will be more frank. We're in an age of openness and scrutiny, but there are sometimes needs for challenges to be ironed out and then shared and scrutinised, rather than all of it in the open. So there will be an all-party group looking at the local plan, and there will be regular scrutiny through it's whatever else is on the place scrutiny agenda, the local plan will be on it.
Good to hear that, Mark. to be honest with you. But I will leave that down to the chairs of the ONS scrutinies to make a decision on what their task and finishes group is going to be with their scrutiny.
Sorry. Really, so just how we want to, you know, in terms of recommendations to Housing ONS, if we want to disband or continue, because that's, you know, sorry. I just want clarity.
Yeah, right. We recommend to disband the group,
Yeah,
but under the new ONS structure,
yeah,
there will be a task and finish group that will take this work into consideration
yeah. But
in consultation with the chair of that ONS particular group at the time.
thank you. Oh, thank
That's
you.
it. And the time is now 6 minutes past 7. And thank you all.